I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
So, William, I suppose the Black Dahlia is America's kind of most notorious cold case. I suppose it's hard to believe that 80 years on, we're still talking about it. But I suppose if we could just kind of go back in time, we're in Los Angeles in the 1940s, and we're just after the Great Depression. Kind of film noir and Hollywood are kind of booming, but people are flocking to Los Angeles kind of looking for stardom. But I suppose this story truly begins in January 1947 with the discovery of a body. Could you kind of describe how Elizabeth Short was found?
A body was spotted by a passerby in a vacant lot in a new housing development in South Central Los Angeles. The passerby didn't stay long to look at what it was because she suspected it was something she didn't want to look at. So two officers came out and discovered that the body was actually in two parts. It had been cut through the center of the torso. Not only that, but it had been drained of all its blood. So it was an unearthly white color. In fact, when the officers first arrived, they thought it was a mannequin. They thought it was like a store mannequin that had been, left on the side of the road. But it was a real human being. It had also been mutilated. There were various cuts and gouges in the body, and most gruesomely, perhaps, though it's all pretty gruesome, a Glasgow smile had been carved on her face, so that a knife had been drawn up from each end of her mouth up towards her ears. So this was like nothing anyone had ever seen before, and of course it drew a lot of attention. And the detectives arrived, and the body was transported to the morgue where it underwent an autopsy. Had no idea who this young woman was. There was speculation she might have been a young teenager. Other people said, no, she's older than that. And it took a long detective process, which we can go into, or certainly I detail it in the book, of how they actually discovered the identity of this young woman.
Mm-hmm. And we obviously know that the identity of that woman was Elizabeth Short. But I suppose to people who are unfamiliar with the case, could you kind of describe who Elizabeth Short was? She was kind of a budding actor from Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, that's part of the myth. She, one of the things that I realized in doing this book was so much attention has been about finding the killer, because as you said, this is the most notorious unsolved case. So it's always been about finding the killer. And I realized that finding the killer is actually second. I needed to find Elizabeth Short. She was a real human being. She wasn't just this corpse. And she was from a small suburb outside of Boston. She was raised by a single mother after the father abandoned the family. She had 4 sisters. And she was always taught by her mother that her mother told all of her daughters that their destinies were in their own hands, because she had been disappointed by her husband. And she told all her daughters, look, you need to make your lives your own, because you can't always depend on a man. So Elizabeth was not a good student. And she also suffered from pleurisy and asthma, so it made the cold New England winters very difficult for her. So she convinced her mother to let her drop out of school and spend the winters in Florida. And then after that, to start exploring the world. She would get on the bus and she'd go to Chicago. She'd go back to Florida. She went to California a couple of times. And this is a young woman who the myth would turn into possibly a sex worker or involved with gangsters. And then there's that story that she wanted to be an actress. She wanted to be the famous movie star. So that's why she went to Los Angeles. But none of that's true. She was just a curious, independent young woman who was defying the social imperative to get married and have children. You know, she was when she first went out to Los Angeles, she was 21 years old, and she wanted to see the world. She wanted to explore places and see places. So, you know, finding that part of her was just as important to me as trying to find her killer, because she's been maligned for so many decades now, as you say, for 80 years. And I thought, you know, I really wanted to give her back the agency that she actually had.
No, 100%. And do we know exactly why she was in LA at the time? Or was she just kind of drifting from place to place?
Well, she had gone out to meet a boyfriend and he was in the army, and he was stationed in Long Beach, which is just south of Los Angeles. So she went out there with him, but she was never really interested in settling down. He wanted to, you know, her to be all his and all that. She just kind of wanted to keep exploring. So they separated, and she went up to Hollywood because that was the place to go. That's where things were happening. And she met an old friend and a woman, and they shared an apartment. And that's something else in the book that I discovered. You know, the press after her death made a lot of Elizabeth. She had so many boyfriends, and she did, though they were all fairly innocent. But she also had a lot of women in her life too, and those stories have not always been talked about. In fact, they've hardly ever been talked about. That she had this support network of women that really helped, you know, shape her time in Los Angeles.
Totally. And I suppose just bringing us back to the discovery of this body, she was quickly called the Black Dahlia. I know obviously journalists often kind of come up with names about the individuals they're writing about, but why the Black Dahlia? Can you kind of give us a sense as well, I suppose, of the media coverage right at the time on this case, and why the Black Dahlia?
Yeah, it's that's another part of the myth that people say, oh, she was called the Black Dahlia because she wore these, you know, black sheer clothing, and she always wore flowers in her hair, and you know, she had very dark hair, and all the friends and all the people around her would call her the Black Dahlia, but none of that's true either. You know, when they first discovered her identity, that she was Elizabeth Short, a reporter went down to one of the places in Long Beach where she had been seen when she first came out to California. And kind of in an offhand comment, the clerk behind the counter said, "Oh yeah," he said something like, "You know, the guys here all kind of referred to her as the Black Dahlia, you know, because she had such black hair. And down the street, the movie The Blue Dahlia was playing, so she became the Black Dahlia." And so it was not a name she ever knew in life. None of her friends ever heard her, you know, called that. But the press, of course, jumps on that, especially the more sensationalist press of Los Angeles at the time. And they had several papers that were really about, you know, making, you know, they wanted to sell newspapers. So a sexy moniker like the Black Dahlia was going to do it.
Totally. And I suppose what initially drew you to write about the Black Dahlia, because obviously we know over the 80 years of this cold case, it's been like extensively covered. But what made you find kind of this new slant on the story and want to give, I suppose, Elizabeth back her agency, I guess?
Yes, I mean, it was, you know, most of my career I've spent writing biographies of Hollywood actors and directors. But I had done a previous true crime book and really, really enjoyed the experience because it allows you to tell a much bigger story. It's not just one life you're following. It's, you know, a community or an industry. You're telling, you know, how many lives intersect. So I was looking for another opportunity to do a book like that. And my editor said, "What about the Black Dahlia?" And as you've just pointed out, I said, "Well, there's been so many books about it." And he said, "Well, look into it, see what you can find." And so I did, and I realized that all of the previous books, as I was saying earlier, really were about, aha, I've solved the case, you know, thumping their chests and saying, I did what those detectives couldn't do. And I said, and all of these books contain so many descriptions of Elizabeth that I just felt, there's something about that doesn't seem right. So I began doing a little digging, and I began realizing that none of these books had really gotten to the real woman, the real person, and that and so many of them were defined by confirmation bias. And by that, I mean, these writers determined who was the killer, and then all of the information they presented to the reader was in support of that conclusion. Anything that was not in support of that conclusion wasn't there. So in my book, I had two objectives. It was one to restore the humanity of Elizabeth Short, but also to take a look at the investigation with a clear focus and, providing all of the information. I do, at the end of the book, identify a suspect that I believe is the most likely to have been the killer, but I don't say that I've definitely solved it, because there's still so much information and evidence that is locked up at the Los Angeles Police Department that they haven't allowed us to see. So given what we have, I think this one suspect is the most likely killer. However, the more important point of the book is that if we can't absolutely find the killer, we can find Elizabeth Short.
Absolutely. I think people still nonetheless are kind of curious about who these potential suspects are. So if you could possibly kind of touch on maybe potential previous suitors she had, and I suppose suspects that we have in this case.
Yeah, there have been, it's the classic Hollywood noir murder case, right? So there's all of these different suspects. There's the wealthy nightclub owner who is married, but he keeps women on the side, and Elizabeth lived with him for a while. His name was Mark Hansen. I explore his relationship with Elizabeth and the possibility that he could have been the killer. There's a former boyfriend who she lived with, may have been abusive to her, and who had a violent temper, came out of World War II with a lot of PTSD. So he's a possibility that I go into. There's so many others. There's, even her roommate, one of her roommates at the time, stories were built up that, it's clear the roommate was a sex worker. And so there's this, one theory was that Elizabeth was also a sex worker, and they were competing, and so there was jealousy about that. So some of the theories are really far-fetched, and have no basis in reality. Some, I explore that might actually be possible. There's been previous books that have taken newsstands, and there's about 20 years ago there was a whole series of books that came out by a former Los Angeles police detective who suddenly decided that his father had killed Elizabeth Short, and there were a number of books about that. There's really no evidence to back any of that up. But so people love playing the game in many ways, and I get it. Who was Jack the Ripper? Who was all of these? People like this theory, and in some ways, I don't think people really want to solve any of these cases because it takes away the guesswork.
Kind of the excitement in the case, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
I suppose, given how long ago this all happened, how did you kind of go about getting these accounts and bring Elizabeth Short's story to life? Getting witness accounts from the time, you have a good blend of friends and associates of hers over time. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's... As I was saying, there's so much evidence we don't have because it's not been released by the LAPD, but there is quite a bit there. The district attorney's office of Los Angeles County had undertaken its own investigation when the LAPD search kind of went off the rails. And so we have all of those records. Those records have all been released. And it's, there's literally thousands of names in there that I was able to follow up and try to piece their lives together, because if I could piece the lives of those people around Elizabeth together, I could get a reflection of how, if these people were experiencing this, well, Elizabeth was as well. And fortunately, I was able to track down families of many of these people. So families of her friends, also families of the original detectives who were fantastic to work with because they had direct memory of what their grandparents and uncles were saying about about the case and what they thought about the case. I also talked to some families of suspects, and some of them I said, I think I'm going to be able to exonerate your grandfather, so I don't think you have to worry about this. But others, I said, well, I'm not really going to be able to exonerate for you. Yeah, but it was finding them, and by getting their stories, you can start building the whole world that existed around Elizabeth.
Mm. And were there any sources or archives in particular that kind of changed your understanding of the case in particular?
They all did, because it was really about assembling a puzzle, trying to put as many pieces together. We're always going to be missing some pieces, but I feel like I got enough pieces assembled. But probably the most poignant and most surprising find was there's a very Medford, Massachusetts, where Elizabeth is from, is a very small little New England town, and very quaint, very charming. And so they have a historical society. So I went there because they said they had some material on Elizabeth. I said I should see what it is. And a writer who several years ago had tried to write about Elizabeth, and this writer was in fact a family friend and knew Elizabeth's sisters. And so in the archives of this collection, there were interviews with Elizabeth's sisters, letters from her mother, and it really opened up, allowed me to see the real person again. I learned that Elizabeth was, she loved stray dogs. She was always taking in stray dogs. She was very kind to a neighborhood child who had been molested at school. And so she made it a point to go spend time with that little girl to make sure she felt safe. Her kindness and her humanity comes through in those letters in a way that probably I wouldn't have been able to find anywhere else.
Totally. And I suppose we did touch on this, but why do you think there's such a strong desire to solve this case even 80 years later? What is it about this one? It's just the glitz, the glamour, the kind of Hollywood element, or what is it?
Yeah, I think it's because the Black Dahlia myth became so embedded in popular culture. So many movies after the murder. Film noir is a genre that takes off after the murder. Now, I'm not saying the murder created film noir by any means, but the murder did influence how many of those stories were told about the dark shadows at night, and the underworld of Los Angeles, and the shattered lives and all of that. And so it becomes it becomes a trope in many ways, and we've seen it portrayed in various films, not, some of which have been very closely modeled on the case, others that it just take elements of it, but it's there. It's very emblematic of what we think of as film noir and Los Angeles noir. Elizabeth has been called by one podcaster, which I always loved. She was the chanteuse of Los Angeles noir. And it's true. So I think she stands apart from some of the other stories that, if we can solve this case, it's kind of the holy grail of it all. This is the one, if you can solve this one. And, we've seen a lot of attempts recently too, at people trying to connect it to other cases like the Zodiac killings and all of that. And interesting theories, but again, it's so important in trying to put this together is to make sure that we have make sure we have hard evidence to support everything we try to put together, because otherwise it just becomes kind of like a game of Clue.
Totally agree. And I suppose finally, William, what do you kind of hope readers take away from this version of the Black Dahlia that kind of previous books failed to offer?
I hope they come away with a much better understanding of Elizabeth Short, and by extension, what women were going through and what they were experiencing in those years after World War II. So during the war, with so many men off fighting overseas, American women saved the economy because they went into the factories, they went into the offices, and they really stepped in and for the war effort. But then the men start coming home, and the women are expected to go back home and put on an apron and have children and babies and all of that. And a lot of women were not willing to do that. They said, I'm going to still go and explore the world. I'm still going to go ahead and, write my own story and, find my own destiny. And, Elizabeth wasn't a feminist or anything. I'm not saying that. She just was somebody who wanted to live her life just as the way so many other women were. So I hope that people come away with a sense of who Elizabeth Short was and how she fit in that particular moment of history. How she wasn't an outlier. She was actually part of a larger movement of women who were charting their own lives.
Absolutely. So the book obviously is The Black Dahlia by you, William J. Mann, and it's out on the 27th of January, I believe.
27th, yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have you checked out our new website, crimeworld.com, where you'll find ad-free exclusive content, including our new series, The Science of Fear, about the rise and fall of Daniel Kinahan's right-hand man, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. Subscribers can listen to all 9 parts, but for those of you not yet signed up, here's an extract from part 1. It's July 25th. Ipswich Crown Court. 3 of Ireland's most notorious criminals flicker onto the courtroom screens from prisons across England. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh appears on Zoom from Belmarsh Prison, looking surprisingly tanned and trim in a dark grey t-shirt. Beside him on the screen, his lieutenants Gary Flash Vickery and Daniel Canning appear from other prisons, fidgeting in their seats. In contrast, Kavanagh sits bolt upright, with arms folded across his chest, and listens intently in an interview room with bathroom blue walls. As a female prison guard nips in and out of Kavanagh's interview room, the exasperated judge, Justice Martin Levitt, stops proceedings to scold, "We'll just wait for Belmarsh to stop coming in and out of the room because it's interrupting us yet again." Over the morning, there are various arguments set out by wigged barristers who call each other "my learned friend" in clipped British accents. But the outcome is clear. Kavanagh has 3 months to pay back more than €1.26 million in criminal assets, or face another 12 years in prison. One by one, the court strips him of his assets: luxury watches, designer clothes, equity in a Majorcan property, rental income, cash seized by police, and even the cost of a family holiday to Cancun. And the biggest blow, his half share of a fortified Tamworth mansion, the marble-floored stronghold where he reigned like an Italian mob boss in the English Midlands. The court was told his wife, Joanne Byrne, the sister of David Byrne, who was murdered in the Regency, had not responded to a court notice. Kavanagh, sitting at a wooden desk in Belmarsh, betrays no sign of emotion at the prospect of losing the family home. But behind that blank stare is a man who once weaponised fear with precision. Police wiretaps revealed a mobster, almost scientific, in his obsession with torture, casually calculating exactly how much pain he could inflict, terrifying men into loyalty without paralysing them completely. Britain's National Crime Agency finally brought him down, jailing him for 26 years. Now, here in Ipswich Crown Court, they're dismantling what's left of his empire. And then, one final twist. It appears that Bomber couldn't do his time. In a scheme that wouldn't have been out of place in a Guy Ritchie movie, Kavanagh tried to shave some time off his 21-year sentence for drug smuggling by orchestrating a plot from behind bars. Hoping to dupe authorities into handing him a lighter sentence, he tried to lead the National Crime Agency officers to a weapons stash. Instead, he was rumbled and slapped with another 6 years. We spoke to some of the NCA officers who were involved in taking Bomber down, including one who was tasked with following the money. It was a job that took him across international borders.
This particular case, I would say, was complex because we had overseas assets in Ireland and in Spain, Lanzarote, and there was also the inquiries when pulling together the investigation as well, because there was Dutch hauliers involved. There was drugs that were coming in, say, from the Netherlands. They were coming in from Spain. So there was quite a lot of international partners we were involved with when we were pulling this together. So the actual value of the drugs, which was agreed on between the prosecution and defence, eventually was 10,470,833, and that was it was 3,750,833 of cannabis and 6,720,000 pounds worth of cocaine. The benefit figure for Thomas, with all the other assets involved, we agreed on just over 12 million of benefit from his criminality. And we started off somewhere around 15, 16 million. So we've come down about 4 million. And the majority of that is the difference in the value of the drugs. Knowing the significance of him, it was really great result to get him convicted and now to get the confiscation order against him as well and have that benefit hanging over him.
Officers who went through the rows of designer gear in Bomber's gated mansion were astonished at the sheer scale of luxury goods. The drug proceeds had been splurged on luxury and security in almost equal measure. The place was sealed, reinforced doors, bulletproof glass, and cameras covering every approach. Inside was a display of wealth that would rival that of Imelda Marcos. Money was lavished on Moncler jackets, a shoe collection worthy of a Saudi princess, and a watch collection fit for a Premier League dressing room. The list goes on. 30 pairs of identical Armani jeans, Gucci labels, a collection of handbags that a Kardashian would be proud of. This was how the cartel's profits were laundered, through spending sprees and rolls of cash handed across the shop counters in Harrods. The definition of ill-gotten gains was hanging in wardrobes in his luxury mansion in Tamworth. Cartel members know the risk of peddling drugs across international borders, but when officers start rifling through their six-figure wardrobes, confiscating their luxury watches and handbag collections, it does hit a nerve.
A lot of criminals are quite happy, getting imprisoned for the crime is part of the job. But when you actually say, now we're going to take all your assets, that's when it gets personal, because that's the reason they're committing crime, is for their lifestyle. That's their job. And we are then taking it all away or getting an order to take it away. So that's when it can get quite personal.
The court's inventory of Bomber's lavish spending gave an inkling into just how far removed he'd become from the day-to-day drug trade. He oversaw the delegation of smuggling routes, of finance and of enforcement to trusted lieutenants. The proceedings in Ipswich Crown Court didn't just mark the fall of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's personal empire. They also signal something far bigger. Bomber's collapse marks the first true fracture in what had long looked like an impenetrable underworld machine. The cartel's chief strategist, the man who kept its international supply lines running smoothly, had finally been taken down. Seen as untouchable for years, his sentence for importing tens of millions of pounds of drugs was a major shot across the bow of the Kinahan cartel. And just 2 weeks after Kavanagh's sentencing, the United States raised the stakes.
And so today, the United States Department of State is pleased to announce a reward of up to $5 million for information leading to the financial disruption of the KTCO or the arrest and convictions of its leaders, Christopher Vincent Kinahan, Daniel Joseph Kinahan, and Christopher Kinahan Jr.
You've been listening to an extract from our 9-part series, The Science of Fear, about the rise and fall of Daniel Kinahan's right-hand man, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. To listen to all 9 parts, log on to crimeworld.com and hit subscribe.